The streets are quieter now. In the fading light, a lone cafe sits empty, its chalkboard menu still advertising last winter's soup. Across town, a petrol station line winds past darkened shopfronts, the hum of idling engines mixing with the restless shuffle of feet. In the countryside, fields lie cracked and empty, their furrows holding the silence of a harvest that never came. Behind these still images, something larger is shifting. Hospitals stretch their staff to breaking point. Families leave homes that have been in their name for generations. The cost of life itself, food, shelter, warmth, climbs higher than the pension can reach. There is no single sound of collapse. It arrives quietly, like rust spreading under paint. How close is the breaking point, and will it come all at once, or piece by piece? What's unfolding here is not distant, not abstract. It is closer than we think. Number 10. The housing crisis. For generations, the Australian dream was built on a quiet promise. A home of one's own. A backyard where children could play cricket until dusk. A letterbox that carried more birthday cards than bills. A front porch where neighbors waved and stopped to talk. It was more than property. It was belonging. But that promise, once as solid as brick and mortar, is now slipping beyond the reach of the very people it was meant to protect. The fracture began when houses stopped being homes and became commodities. Policy choices rewarded speculation over shelter. Banks lent more, buyers bid higher, and investors began to see neighborhoods as portfolios. In Sydney, the median house now costs over $1.6 million, more than 10 times the average income. What was once a steady climb toward ownership has become a cliff face that many cannot scale. The human cost is not abstract. Pensioners, who worked a lifetime to pay off their homes, now watch their children rent into middle age, their grandchildren sharing bedrooms in overcrowded flats. Young couples put off having families because they cannot afford the space to raise them. In rural towns, for sale signs stay up for months, not because there are no buyers, but because no one can meet the asking price. The sound of laughter in these homes is replaced by the low hum of worry. When a nation's people can no longer afford to live where they were born, what does that say about the values it holds? And what kind of legacy is left when the idea of home is auctioned to the highest bidder? This has not been a sudden collapse. It has been a slow, steady erosion, one that now seeps into every corner of Australian life, setting the stage for what comes next. Number 9. Rising national debt and hidden deficits. From a distance, the nation's books appear balanced. Budgets are announced with polished speeches. Headlines speak of growth, but behind the numbers, a quieter story unfolds, one written in red ink. Australia's national debt now hovers near $1 trillion, a figure so vast it's almost abstract, yet its weight is anything but invisible. This debt is not just the product of miscalculation. It is the result of decades of spending more than we save, of patching cracks instead of repairing the foundation. Interest repayments alone now climb faster than the economy itself, siphoning funds from hospitals, aged care, and the schools that should prepare the next generation. It is money spent not on building, but on catching up. The human toll hides in plain sight. A regional hospital postpones upgrades because the funding never comes. A pensioner's aged care home cuts staff, leaving residents waiting longer for help. A small-town bridge remains unrepaired for another year, its rusting girders a silent warning. Every repayment made on this debt is a service delayed, a promise deferred. The question lingers: if a nation must choose between paying for its past and investing in its future, which will it sacrifice? And what does that choice say about who we are? This is not an isolated problem. It bleeds into every decision, shaping what is possible and what is quietly abandoned. And in the shadow of this debt, other costs are already rising, costs that no budget surplus can erase. Number 8. The cost of living surge. In the corner of a suburban supermarket, a woman stands motionless in front of the bread aisle. She is not deciding between brands. She is calculating. Every loaf, every bag of rice, every bottle of milk is now part of an equation that ends with less on the table. Across the country, this quiet arithmetic plays out in kitchens, market stalls, and petrol stations. The numbers tell part of the story. Food prices climbing more than 7% in a year. Electricity bills doubling in some regions since 2020. Fuel costs rising and falling like the tide, but never returning to shore. But statistics cannot capture the moment when a pensioner chooses between running the heater and refilling a prescription. They cannot measure the weight of telling a child that their favorite fruit is now too dear. For many older Australians, the memories are vivid: post-war frugality, the oil shocks of the 1970s, the interest rate spikes of the 1990s. But this time feels different. The pinch is not a season, it is becoming a way of life. Like salt dissolving into water, inflation seeps into everything, unseen yet unmistakable in its taste. And so the question deepens: what happens to a society when the essentials become luxuries? When dignity itself comes with a price tag? This strain does not stop at the checkout. It stretches across the farmlands and the factory floors, where another, older challenge is gathering force, one shaped not by the market, but by the land itself. Number 7. Climate shocks and droughts. The land has always been Australia's heartbeat, vast, unpredictable, and stubbornly beautiful. But in recent years, its rhythm has begun to falter. In some places, the rains no longer come at all. In others, they arrive all at once, flooding towns before the ground can drink. Drought and deluge now trade places with unsettling speed. In 2024, heat waves shattered 5 national temperature records, baking riverbeds into cracked mosaics and leaving the Murray-Darling Basin gasping for water. Farmers, who once measured seasons in harvests, now measure them in losses. Entire crops withered before they could be picked. Herds sold early to avoid starvation. It is not just the land that suffers. When supply falls, prices rise, and the ripple reaches every kitchen table. The human cost is etched in the faces of those who work the soil. A 4th-generation wheat farmer watches as another season ends in dust. A rural town's last grocery store closes when the freight trucks stop coming. The air carries the dry scent of grass fires, a reminder that the next spark could change everything. Like a slow tide eroding a shoreline, these shocks wear away not just the economy, but the certainty of place. And the question grows sharper: how does a nation feed itself when its own land turns against it? This challenge is not coming. It is here, and it collides with another force already reshaping the country: the reality of an aging population and a workforce too small to meet its growing needs. If you've been following these stories, you know they are more than headlines. They are the threads of our shared future. Tell us where you're watching from and what in this journey has stayed with you so far. And if you wish to walk with us through the chapters still to come, subscribe so you'll be here when the next piece of the story unfolds. Number 6. The aging population and workforce shortage. For much of its history, Australia saw itself as a young nation, full of vigor, building and expanding with each new generation. Streets were busy with workers in their prime. Factories rang with the sound of production, and rural towns bustled with family-run shops. But that image, once central to the nation's identity, is quietly changing. Today, Australia is growing older, and the hands needed to care for it are fewer than ever. The shift is structural, not seasonal. By 2030, 1 in every 5 Australians will be over the age of 65. Yet the workforce is shrinking in key sectors, especially in aged care, healthcare, and regional services. The shortage already numbers in the tens of thousands. It is not only a matter of filling jobs, it is the loss of skills, experience, and the capacity to meet even the most basic needs. The human cost is visible in the waiting rooms of rural hospitals, where patients sit for hours because there is only one doctor on duty. It is felt in aged care homes, where fewer staff means slower response times, and in small towns where the last general store because no one remains to run it. Families travel hundreds of kilometers to visit elderly parents because there are no local facilities to keep them close. A question rises, quiet but persistent: what becomes of a society when it has more elders than it can care for? What legacy is passed down if the years earned through hard work are spent in neglect rather than dignity? This is not simply a demographic trend. It is a slow, unfolding reality that will shape how every other challenge is faced, and it is already straining the foundations of the economy. Australia has long relied on foundations built on just two fragile pillars. Number 5. Over-reliance on housing and mining. For decades, Australia's prosperity has rested on two great engines. One was the housing market, a steady climb in property values that made homeowners feel wealthier year after year. The other was the earth itself. Vast reserves of iron ore, coal, and minerals shipped to a hungry world. Together, they created a sense of stability, as if the nation's fortune was tied to resources too solid to fail. But the truth is more fragile. More than 60% of household wealth now sits in property, a market vulnerable to interest rate shocks and falling demand. Mining exports, meanwhile, depend heavily on the needs of a few major buyers, most of all China. When global markets slow or shift, the impact is immediate. Mines close, jobs vanish, towns that once thrived empty almost overnight. The human cost is not just in lost income. It is in the erosion of entire communities. In the Pilbara, motels that once housed fly-in fly-out workers now stand empty, their signs sun-faded and peeling. In outer suburbs, new housing estates rise while small businesses close, revealing a paradox. Construction booms, even as the foundations of the economy narrow. What happens to a nation when its future rests on just two pillars, and both begin to crack? What resilience is left when diversity of industry is replaced by dependence? This is not a collapse that will arrive with a single event. It is a slow narrowing of options, a quiet tightening of the noose. And as these pillars weaken, another truth emerges. Australia has fewer tools to make what it needs, even in times of calm, let alone in times of crisis. Number 4. Declining manufacturing and self-reliance. There was a time when Australia made what it needed. Shipyards built vessels that crossed oceans. Factories turned out trains, cars, and farm machinery. Even in the smallest towns, there were workshops where skilled hands could repair almost anything. To be self-reliant was not a slogan. It was simply how the country worked. That world has faded. Manufacturing now accounts for less than 6% of the economy, down from a quarter in the 1960s. In its place is a dependence on imports, on goods built far away, arriving in steel containers from ports thousands of kilometers across the sea. It works well enough in times of stability, but when global supply chains falter, the gap is revealed. Shelves empty. Repairs wait for parts that never arrive. Essential equipment costs more and takes longer to reach those who need it. The human cost is felt quietly. In rural towns, old repair shops are now coffee houses, their tools sold off in dusty auctions. In cities, skilled trades that once provided steady work have become rare, their apprenticeships fewer with each passing year. The knowledge, the muscle memory of how to build and fix, fades with each retiring craftsman. A nation without its own tools is like a sailor without a compass. It may drift unnoticed in calm waters, but when the storm comes, direction is everything. And that storm is building. Because as Australia grows more dependent on the outside world for what it consumes, it is also bringing more people in, at a pace that tests the limits of its housing, infrastructure, and social fabric. Number 3. Immigration policy strain. For much of its history, Australia has drawn strength from those who chose to make it home. Waves of migration brought new skills, cultures, and industries, helping to build a nation both prosperous and diverse. The story was simple. There was space to grow, work to do, and a future to shape together. But today, the balance is shifting. In 2023 alone, net migration topped 500,000 people, the highest on record. Yet the housing, infrastructure, and essential services that new arrivals depend upon have not kept pace. The result is a strain felt not only by the newcomers, but by those who have lived here all their lives. Cities swell, roads choke with traffic, and hospitals face queues that stretch the limits of care. The human cost unfolds in everyday moments. Families spend years on waiting lists for public housing. Commuters stand shoulder to shoulder on trains built for a smaller population. In outer suburbs, new estates rise without the schools, clinics, or transport to connect them. For older Australians, the towns they once knew feel unrecognizable, busier, but not always better equipped. Immigration in itself is not the fault line. It is the absence of planning to match growth with capacity. A bigger table means little if there is not enough food to share. So the question remains, how do you welcome more people without eroding the quality of life for those already here? What happens to the promise of opportunity when competition for the basics becomes a constant undercurrent? These pressures do not exist in isolation. They collide with the wider economic forces of a world that is slowing, reshaping the markets on which Australia's fortunes have long depended. Number 2. The global economic slowdown. Australia's economy has always been tied to the wider world. Ships leave its ports, laden with iron ore, coal, wheat, and wine, bound for markets that can transform a season's harvest into a nation's windfall. For decades, those markets seemed certain, their demand steady. But now, the world's rhythm is changing. China, Australia's largest trading partner, is grappling with its own property crisis and slowing growth. Global shipping lanes, once predictable, have been disrupted by geopolitical tensions and climate-related events. Commodity prices, once buoyant, are slipping. Each change overseas sends quiet tremors through Australian towns. Mining shifts cut short, farms paid less for their produce, exporters facing orders that no longer come. The human impact is felt in the small, unremarkable closures. A portside cafe loses its morning crowd when the dockwork dries up. A farm equipment dealer sees sales vanish as wheat prices fall. Local councils delay projects because the rate's revenue from struggling businesses is no longer there. The slowdown is not sudden. It is a gradual tightening, a sense that the future will be leaner than the past. For a nation so dependent on the health of distant economies, it is a reminder of vulnerability that prosperity built on global demand can vanish with its decline. And yet, the most fragile currency is not iron ore, coal, or wheat. It is trust, the belief that the systems guiding the country will hold when tested, and that, more than any market shift, may decide what comes next. Number 1. The loss of trust in institutions. Nations are held together not only by laws and economies, but by an invisible thread: trust. Trust that governments will act in the public's interest. Trust that institutions will protect the vulnerable. Trust that promises made will, in time, be kept. For generations, Australians believed in that thread. It was not perfect, but it was strong enough to hold. Today, that fabric is fraying. Surveys show trust in government at historic lows. Fewer than half of Australians believe their leaders are listening. Scandals, broken promises, and policies that seem to serve the few over the many have left a quiet disillusionment. It is not always voiced aloud, but it is felt. In the shrug when a policy changes, yet nothing improves. In the growing sense that decisions are made far from the people they affect. The cost is more than political. When trust fades, cooperation follows. Communities fracture into suspicion. Reform becomes harder because fewer believe in the hands guiding it. A society that cannot rally behind its own institutions finds itself adrift in moments of crisis, each person looking inward rather than toward a shared solution. And so the question becomes unavoidable. If trust is lost, what anchors a nation in the storms to come? What happens when the lifeboat is still there, but no one believes it will hold? This is the quiet danger, the one without sirens or headlines. And as the pressures we have traced, from housing and debt to climate and global change, continue to build, the strength of that invisible thread may be the difference between a nation that weathers the storm and one that is swept away. What we've just seen isn't just news. It's a mirror, reflecting the pressures building across a nation that has long believed in its own stability. These are not distant or abstract problems. They are lived realities, shaping the choices people make every day, from the suburbs to the smallest rural towns. Behind every statistic is a family making sacrifices. Behind every policy decision is a community that must live with its consequences. The challenges we've explored: housing, debt, the cost of living, climate, an aging population, dependence on fragile industries, and fading trust, are not isolated threads. They are connected, and together they define the future that will be inherited by the next generation. There are no instant solutions, but awareness is a first step. Staying informed, asking hard questions, and holding leaders accountable can help steer the path ahead. It means voting with both conscience and memory, supporting policies that balance economic growth with social stability, and keeping the most vulnerable in focus when decisions are made. These stories will not end here. They are still unfolding, and how they resolve will depend on what we choose to do and whether we choose to notice. If you want to follow this journey and understand what happens next, subscribe to the channel. Share in the comments where you're watching from and which part of this story spoke to you most. If you know someone who should see this, send it to them directly so the conversation continues.